There is a moment, documented across dozens of civilizations, across centuries of recorded economic collapse, when ordinary people wake up and discover that what they believed they owned no longer belongs to them. Not through theft in the conventional sense, not through violence in the night, but through the quiet, legal, and devastatingly efficient machinery of a system under extreme stress. This is not a warning about what might happen. This is a forensic analysis of what has already happened, repeatedly, predictably, and always with the same target struck first. In 1933, the United States government issued Executive Order 6102, compelling American citizens to surrender their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to Federal Reserve banks at a fixed price of $20.67 per troy ounce. Within months of that forced exchange, the official price was reset to $35 per ounce, a 69% devaluation that transferred enormous real wealth away from private hands and into institutional control. What is critical to understand here is not the political context but the mechanical sequence. First came the emergency declaration, then came the legal framework, then came enforcement, and finally came the revaluation that made the seizure permanently profitable for the state. Citizens who complied lost. The small percentage who had already diversified their holdings into foreign accounts, land, productive assets, or non-reportable forms of value, they survived with their wealth largely intact. This pattern did not begin in 1933, nor did it end there. When the Byzantine Empire faced repeated fiscal crises between the 7th and 11th centuries, emperors systematically debased the gold solidus, a coin that had maintained its purity for over 3 centuries, reducing its gold content incrementally while maintaining its face value. The population did not immediately recognize what was happening because the change was gradual, technical, and wrapped in the language of monetary stability. Merchants and landowners who held their wealth in the coin itself were slowly impoverished. Those who had converted surplus wealth into durable goods, land with productive capacity, or trade relationships that operated outside the coin-dependent economy maintained generational stability. The lesson embedded in that history is precise. When a store of value is controlled by the same entity experiencing the crisis, that store of value will be sacrificed to manage the crisis. The misunderstanding that most people carry into periods of economic instability is the belief that their wealth is protected by its legality. That because something is lawfully owned, it cannot be lawfully taken. But the historical and legal record tells a fundamentally different story. Property rights are not absolute under any constitutional system ever devised. They are conditional, subject to eminent domain, emergency powers, wartime authority, and financial regulation. In Cyprus in 2013, depositors with accounts above €100,000 had a percentage of their funds directly converted into bank equity without consent, a bail-in mechanism that was entirely legal under the emergency framework activated by the Eurozone crisis. The people who lost the least were not those with the best lawyers. They were those who had already moved portions of their liquid wealth into jurisdictions, asset classes, or physical forms that were structurally outside the reach of that specific mechanism. What survivors across history understood, whether consciously or through inherited cultural wisdom, is what modern behavioral economists now call asset diversification across seizure vectors. This is not simply the financial advisor's advice to hold a mix of stocks and bonds. It is the deeper recognition that different categories of wealth are vulnerable to different categories of threat, and that no single threat can simultaneously reach all categories at once. Physical gold in a foreign jurisdiction cannot be frozen by a domestic banking order. Productive land cannot be inflated away. Skills and knowledge cannot be confiscated by any executive order ever written. The survivors of the Weimar hyperinflation in 1920s Germany were disproportionately farmers, tradespeople, and those who had converted paper wealth into physical productive capacity before the collapse accelerated. They did not predict the exact mechanism of destruction. They simply understood, through historical literacy or practical instinct, that paper promises are the first casualty of systemic stress. The evidence across these cases converges on a single, uncomfortable, and actionable truth. The window between the first visible signs of systemic stress and the moment of actual seizure is always shorter than people expect, and always longer than the moment people finally act. Understanding that window, its historical length, its warning signals, and the specific moves that have protected wealth across radically different cultural and political contexts, is not pessimism. It is the most rigorous form of preparation available to any person operating in an uncertain world. Every seizure in recorded history has followed a recognizable architecture. Not because governments coordinate across centuries, but because the mechanics of fiscal desperation are constrained by the same fundamental variables every time. A state needs resources, legal instruments exist to access private wealth, and the population is psychologically unprepared because normalcy bias, the deeply wired human tendency to assume that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, prevents early action. Understanding this architecture is not about predicting the future. It is about recognizing a pattern so well documented that ignoring it becomes a choice rather than an oversight. The first mechanism is always currency debasement. Before any government moves to directly seize private assets, it will first attempt to solve its resource problem by expanding the money supply, reducing the precious metal content of coinage, or in the modern context, engaging in sustained deficit monetization. This is the quietest and most politically sustainable form of wealth transfer because it requires no legislation targeting individuals, generates no immediate visible victims, and operates through the invisible tax of purchasing power erosion. The Roman Empire debased the silver denarius from approximately 90% silver content in the 1st century AD to less than 5% by the late 3rd century. The result was not simply inflation. It was the systematic destruction of savings held in monetary form while simultaneously enriching those who held debt, land, and commodity inventories. The survivors of that 3-century debasement cycle were the landholding classes and the merchant networks that priced their goods in grain weight rather than coin count. They had, functionally, opted out of the debased monetary system before its final collapse. The second mechanism is capital controls. Once a government recognizes that currency debasement is accelerating capital flight, meaning wealthy and informed citizens are moving assets into foreign currencies, foreign accounts, or physical stores of value, it will move to restrict that movement. Capital controls can take many forms. Limits on foreign currency purchases, restrictions on international wire transfers, taxes on capital outflows, or outright prohibitions on gold ownership or foreign account holding. Argentina has implemented formal capital controls no fewer than 4 times in the last 30 years, each time following a period of monetary expansion that made the controls feel, to the government imposing them, like a necessary emergency measure. The citizens who preserved wealth across those cycles were those who had established legal foreign holdings, dual-denomination business structures, or physical asset positions before the controls were announced, because once announced, the window closes within hours, not weeks. The third mechanism, and the one most consistently underestimated, is the taxation of stored wealth rather than income. Wealth taxes, forced loans to the state, and emergency levies on property have appeared in English history during the 100 Years' War, in French history during the Revolution, in American history during both World Wars, and in European history during the sovereign debt crises of the early 21st century. What makes this mechanism particularly effective from the state's perspective is that it targets accumulated assets rather than current earnings, meaning it strikes hardest at exactly those people who believed that saving and accumulating was the path to security. The historical countermeasure, employed by surviving merchant families in Renaissance Florence, by Jewish communities across medieval Europe who faced asset seizure as a recurring existential threat, and by overseas Chinese business networks throughout Southeast Asia during the political upheavals of the 20th century, was the deliberate conversion of visible, quantifiable, seizable wealth into forms that were either mobile, non-reportable, relational, or embedded in human capital that cannot be inventoried by any external authority. What all of these survivors understood at a structural level is that wealth preservation under systemic stress is not primarily a financial problem. It is an information and positioning problem. The families and communities that survived repeated cycles of seizure, debasement, and confiscation were not necessarily the richest or the most politically connected. They were the most structurally diversified across seizure vectors, the most geographically distributed in their asset holdings, and the most invested in forms of value, skills, relationships, productive land, portable physical assets, that resisted the specific confiscation tools available to the authorities they faced. They did not wait for certainty. They acted on pattern recognition, historical literacy, and the cold understanding that no system under sufficient stress will voluntarily protect the interests of private wealth holders when the alternative is institutional survival. The single most repeated finding across every case study in this forensic record is devastatingly simple. The people who survived did not do anything extraordinary. They did ordinary things: diversify, decentralize, convert, position, at an ordinary time, before the extraordinary moment arrived and made all of those moves impossible.